All right, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I am Rob Tornstra, and today I have with me a guest that I'm really excited to talk to. Her name is Carmon Conover, and she is a Christian sex therapist, and we're going to talk about some of the things that entails, and how kind of the two topics of faith and sexuality come together, as well as some practical guidance and advice for couples. Um, Many of you will know that I've written a book on the topic of Christian sexuality, and so this is a topic that I've had some interest in talking about and writing about, and so I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Obviously, a conversation on the topic of sexuality lends itself to some more explicit content, and so fair warning, this may be one of those conversations that you want to at least make sure that there are no young listeners listening in without you being there to know about it. So, but without any further ado, Carmon, it's so good to have you on the channel. I'm really looking forward to talking with you and hearing some of the things that you have to say. And I want to just start by turning it over to you and letting you introduce yourself and maybe tell a little bit of your story.
Well, hi, Rob. Thanks so much for asking me to come talk with you today. First of all, I need to correct something, and that is I am not yet a Christian sex therapist. So that is my aspiration. I am on my journey toward that, and it
Okay.
has been my goal for some time. So I am not allowed ethically to advertise myself falsely. So I do
Okay,
need
good.
to
Thank you
correct
for
that.
correcting that.
So where I am right now in that journey is I graduated with my master's degree in marriage and family therapy last May. I had been in school full time for 5 years. And so it was quite a relief to get to that point of being graduated and continuing on. As part of my schooling, I was required to be in practicum, which means it's kind of like I compare it to like being in a teaching hospital and doing your residency. If you've watched shows like Grey's Anatomy or something like that, then you see how, that kind of goes with a little less drama, hopefully, than that. But still, it's, quite a journey getting to the place where I feel like I am, where I have arrived. And I don't know that I'll ever get to that point, but I'm on that journey. So I have worked for 2.5 years as a therapist, but as a trainee first. And then when I graduated, I became what's called an associate. So those sound kind of like labels, like I work at Walmart or something, even though I don't want to put anybody down who has, gainful employment. That's a wonderful job to have. But I have these labels attached to me. So I'm about a year away from licensure in the state of California. And that means I will have 3,000 clinical hours, including not just face-to-face, but, doing workshops and supervision and all sorts of things that add to those hours. And then I have to take a big test.
Right.
So I'm
Wow.
working toward that. Yeah.
Okay.
So my journey is kind of an unusual one. Everybody has their own story, and that's part of my theme for how I work with my clients, is honoring that for everyone. But I had been a stay-at-home wife and mom for over 30 years. I have 10 children, and I am a grandma of 9 grandchildren right now. So I like to say that when I'm getting ready to talk to people about the topic of sex, not because the fact that obviously I was able to create 9 children means I know a little bit about that topic, but just because I think that my stage in life helps to make that a more comfortable conversation
Right.
with a lot of people. So I did not work outside the home. I did a lot of different hobbies and activities that were interesting to me and where I connected with a lot of people. And there's a whole story behind that. But that was my life for a long time. And then I decided to go back to college in my 50s. And so that put me on a whole new path toward having a career and getting this education. And so it's very different from my old life. And I
Yeah.
kind of see this delineation between the old and the new in my story. And it's been hard, but it's
Mm,
been good. God has been good to me along this journey. So that's where I am right now.
great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And as you said, every journey is unique, and every person's own story is unique. And of course, yeah, there are challenges along the way, and yet, yeah, to hear God's faithfulness and all of that is a real testimony. Um, so as you are entering into the field of sexuality, and as you are in the process of working with couples and kind of understand this better, I'm curious about the idea of um, Christian sexuality. That's something I've written about, but it's also something, and I'm just wondering if, because there are some people I think that would look at that and wonder if that's some kind of strange mix of ideas. Like, how does Christianity and sexuality mix together? And all through, I think, at least modern history, there's been kind of this funny relationship between um, maybe between Christians and sexuality in general. And maybe we could start there. Maybe you could talk about your perception of how the Christian culture has misconstrued or misunderstood just the idea of sex and sexuality in general.
Sure, but first of all, I just wanted to mention that I happen to have a copy here
All right.
of this wonderful book. And I actually have not had a chance to read it thoroughly yet, but I've been looking it over, and I
Uh-huh.
want to say that I am very impressed by your book, Rob. And I'm
Oh,
so glad
thank
that you
you.
wrote it. And I hope that I can be helpful as far as sharing it around and getting it a little more airplay, because I think you did an awesome job of pointing
Oh,
out how
thank you.
important it is to connect spirituality and sexuality. Those two things actually go hand in
They
hand. And
do.
I think that unfortunately in the church, we have not understood that very well, that we've
Right.
made this false dichotomy between sex and the rest of our life, and especially our
Right.
Christian walk. And I think that it's caused a lot of damage for a
Mm,
lot of people. And it's also made Christians a lot more susceptible to some of the false messages about
mm,
sexuality that are in the world. And so, a Christian view of sexuality, I think, is an understanding of the purpose for which God created us,
mm,
and understanding his desire to have a deep and intimate relationship with each of us individually,
mm,
as well as the church as a whole. And so, God, he is very kind and patient with us and merciful. And he is very condescending to us in a good way.
yeah.
And so when he created sex, I think that it was his way of giving us a wonderful analogy for us to be able to understand him better and understand what our
Wow.
relationship with him should look like. And so I think that that makes people uncomfortable when we talk about the purpose of sex being
Yeah.
so God centric, because we have this message that we've gotten from the world that sex is all about the sensations, and we see how the world
Right.
has perverted this good gift, and that's in our face all the time. And so it's hard for us to kind of step back from that, because we see that picture in front of us so strongly all the time,
Right.
to be able to go back and say, why did God create us as sexual beings? What was his purpose in that? And so the analogy of sex is a very powerful one. You think about what it's like for a little baby. I just was babysitting my youngest grandson last
Mm,
night, and he's He's pretty new still. He's only a few weeks old. And
Mm.
as I look at him and think about how he is just a little sponge soaking up everything around him in the world, and how he really doesn't have a context in which to understand it. And so we, as creatures that God created, are able, because we're made in his image, to understand some things about him, but he also is so far beyond us that it's hard to understand
Right.
who he is and to comprehend his love for us. And so he has given us pictures of all sorts to help us to see that. So like a new baby, for example, if you were to imagine that baby still inside his mother's womb, about to burst into the
Mm.
world, into the light, and into this world of color and sound and sensation, and everything is brand new. How is he supposed to understand that? Because he has no context in which to be able to do it. And so for us, we're like babies
Mm.
who need to have a deeper understanding of God's great love for us. And so he has given us these connections to things around us to help us to be able to connect with him better and to
Right.
understand who he is. And so the transcendent experience of sexuality, the way that we can be vulnerable in that relationship with another human being, how we have the possibility of knowing them
Mm.
intimately and being known by them intimately, and having this openness with them that is like no other relationship,
Mm.
that helps us understand deeply the way that God wants us to be vulnerable
Right.
with.
Right.
And so God created this wonderful experience for us to be able to understand that about him. And so I think that for starters in the church, if we could give people this message that sex has this greater purpose beyond just making babies, beyond just having these good feelings that we can create with each other, beyond just fulfilling these urges that everybody experiences. If we could understand God's greater purpose in it is to help us to learn to enjoy him and know him more
Right.
fully, then that helps to put everything else that can be so confusing about it in a better perspective.
Yeah. Right. That's I mean that's an idea about sexuality that is so profound and yet so rare, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about the nature of God, right? Because you mentioned your grandson, and that's kind of what prompted this thought for me. Um, you have God who's three persons
Sorry.
in one,
Yeah.
and and when so which is incredibly complex, right? The idea of the Trinity is very hard, I think, to wrap our minds around. One of the analogies I think that we have is this idea that when a husband and a wife come together, not just sexually, but in terms of forming this covenant, then in a sense they are the two become one flesh. So there's still two individuals, and yet they're also one flesh that are committed to each other. They love each other, and out of the overflow and out of the expression of that love for one another, they are able to create life and to bring new life into the world, which is not the same as what God does, of course, but it's analogous. I mean, there's some of that
Yes.
parallel there, right? There's this window into the very nature of God Himself, which
Yeah.
um, is a remarkable idea, and it's a very I think it's an idea that is not heard very often in churches or otherwise. And I'm wondering if maybe because you kind of alluded to this too, the idea that message gets really distorted by the church. And I'm wondering if maybe you could expand on some of the ways that the church has misconstrued the idea of sexuality. What wrong messages has the church communicated about sex, do you think?
Well, I think one of the issues in the church that has caused problems surrounding this topic is that I still think there's a latent Gnosticism in the church, even even in places where it shouldn't be. You know, I'm also a Reformed Christian. I also go to a Dutch Reformed church, so I understand your church background, and I think that there's so much that progress that has been made in the Reformed church as far as combating that idea. But when it comes to the idea of sex, I think that we kind of grab hold of that again, like we separate that out from our spiritual life, and we think of that. There's an ick factor that goes along with sexuality for some Christians, where and they shroud it in this mystery that it deserves. Sex does have this mysterious component to it, and the mystery of it is, you know, it culminates in this understanding of, again, as we see in Ephesians, of God's connection to his bride. Right. But there's also this reality to it, this material part of it that people kind of push away, like we don't want to think about that. And again, I think it's because we have gotten so many distorted messages from the world about what sex is, that, and people have so much baggage that they bring into their relationships, and this timidity to be able to talk about it openly in the church, that gives us a vulnerability to those messages being accepted. And so a lot of Christian families, unfortunately, are afraid to address this topic with their children. I think there's a fear that they're going, if they bring up sex to their children, it's going to give them ideas that they should go out and have sex. Unfortunately, they're already going to have that idea. They're going to have hormones when they, you know, go through puberty that are going to create feelings in their bodies. And if you don't give them a good framework for how to address that, then they're going to get messages from other places. They're going to be curious. They're going to be vulnerable. They're going to be open to other people giving them messages that you don't want them to have. And so it's very important that we kind of get away from this idea that the material aspects of sexuality, the parts of our bodies that we don't want to discuss, that there's something icky about that. God created these bodies good. God created these bodies with the sensations that they have. God created the hormones that surge through our bodies at different periods of our lives, particularly puberty is when we start to experience that very strongly, all these new urges. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is all given to us by God for a good reason, to give us the ability to make that connection that he wants us to make with the one that we are supposed to covenant with and be vulnerable with. And so it's all moving toward that. And yet Christians are afraid to talk about it. And that's so sad, because kids are getting so much onslaught from the world about ways to deal with it that are not going to be helpful, that are going to hurt.
What do you think accounts for that? I like the way you put it. You talk about a sort of a latent Gnosticism, which is the idea that we make this division between our bodies and you know, our spirit, and then we sort of treat our bodies as if they're you know, like the ick factor, right? The idea that our bodies are capable of pleasure, and that you know, the hormones and the sensations that we are able to experience, that we're capable of, we sort of treat that as icky, or at least that's the message that has been so often communicated. Why do you think that message has persisted for so long? Why do you think there is that message that physical pleasure is icky or wrong, particularly within the church?
Well, I think that a lot of people have their own experiences that come to bear on that. And so it's complex. And I don't think that there is one answer to that question, Rob. But I do see a lot of people who have come from backgrounds where there's this pendulum that swings too far one way or the other. And so they may have had bad experiences of their own, and they come to Christianity and they find comfort in their relationship with God, but they also might be drawn into the spiritual aspects of that relationship as a way to protect them from bad things happening to them.
Right.
And so then that message gets passed on to their children, wanting to protect them from things as well that maybe they experienced when they were kids. So I do think that the pendulum swings back and forth on this issue. I think that we see that during different periods in the church. And I think actually the pendulum is swinging a little bit more toward more openness again, thankfully, as we're seeing a lot more willingness to talk about sexual issues from a Christian perspective, like we're doing right now. But I think that we still have a lot of baggage that's connected to it. So there's a lot of hurt, I think, behind this, and a lot of trauma that people have experienced, or disappointment, or just bad information that just keeps getting passed along.
So
I think that you're frozen, Rob. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm back. You froze too there for a second. So anyway.
Oh, okay.
So one of the questions that I will often hear from people is, how do we talk to our children then? So if there are these potential wrong messages about sexuality, how do we communicate a better message to our kids?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a scary thing for a lot of people to talk to their kids about sex. I think that it's hard for parents to, first of all, see their children as being sexual beings, and that makes it hard for them because they don't want to even think about the idea that their children someday are going to be in a sexual relationship. And so it's out of sight, out of mind. If we just push that aside, we don't have to think about it. We can keep them little forever, and we don't have to go there. And then, surprise, then there's a problem, and then parents are just devastated when things don't go the way that they had hoped. So first of all, I think it's understanding a view of human development from birth that is reasonable and that does take into account the beauty of the way God has created our bodies to function. And so there's a lot of controversy right now, even in the church, talking about what does it mean to be male or female, right? And so that is a conversation that the church really needs to be on top of, but the world is taking over. And so I think an understanding, first of all, just of the development of our bodies throughout life from birth to death is really helpful for people to get educated on. Understanding that hormones affect your brain development and your sexual functioning from the time that you're born, and that estrogen and testosterone have a huge impact on your body. And so as children are growing up and becoming the individuals that they're going to become, they are, even when they're really little, going to start noticing things about their bodies. They're going to be touching their genitals, and it's going to feel good to them. And that freaks a lot of parents out who really struggle with the idea that, my child is touching themselves. And some parents just go, no, don't do that. That's bad. Right. So one of the first things you can do is don't freak out. Just give them a message of when is it appropriate to touch yourself and when is it not, and start naming the parts of their bodies without cutesy little names, but saying words like penis and vagina to your children, and teaching them what those parts of their bodies are for, what they look like, and not discounting the fact that it feels good when they touch themselves. Now, I'm not encouraging you to, embrace masturbation. That's something that's a very personal issue, but I'm just saying children need to not be taught shame about their bodies.
Right.
Yeah.
Really so there's a difference there between openly promoting and pushing, sexuality at a young age. That's probably before they're ready for it. But between that and say allowing and creating the space to be open and not embarrassed or continuing that ick factor that you talked about earlier when it
Yes.
comes to our own sexuality and the way that God has made us.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so that's the foundation for that, is just being willing to talk to your children about
Yeah.
their bodies. And then as they're growing up and as it's appropriate, and this is very personal for each family to decide, but I do want to let parents know that or that the average age that a child views pornography is 8 years old.
Wow.
So if you have not prepared them for dealing with sexual things
Yeah.
pretty early on, somebody else is going to step in and try to teach them the
Yeah.
wrong lessons. And
Yeah.
so you
Yeah.
do really need to be proactive. And that's a very hard thing in this world now that we live in to embrace, to understand, but it's important that parents be the ones that are teaching their children these
Yeah.
messages, because they're going to get it from somewhere.
Right.
And even good parents are going to be surprised that their kids are going to be clever and figure out how to access some pretty bad stuff online. And I
Right.
have clients who have a lot of problems because of being exposed to pornography at a young age.
Right.
So there's a lot of good books for parents, and I'm a big lover of books, and I see all your books behind you. But I recommend that parents, if they feel like this is a difficult topic for them, that they get access to some good books to teach their children about sex. And there's a book about pornography that I think is really helpful. It's called Pictures, Bad Pictures. And I can't remember the author's name right now, but I can send it to you and maybe you could stick it in your show notes. But you need to sit down with them and go through that stuff, and it will open up conversations. The most important thing is not necessarily that you're going to say it all just right to them,
Right.
but the most important thing is that your children know that they can talk to you about
Right.
sex and that you're going to be okay with that. And not just one conversation.
Yeah.
You need to have hundreds of
Right.
conversations with your children about this topic.
Yeah, because it used to be when I was growing up, it was just kind of assumed that at some point parents have to sit down and have the talk, like there's one talk about it, and usually, if I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek, it was sort of first they give you James Dobson's book, Preparing for Adolescence, or
Right.
something similar, and then okay, read this, and then I'll follow up with it, and that's not, you know I'm not even necessarily trying to say that's the worst thing in the world, but I am trying to say that I think we've changed in our approach so that starting at a very young age, if you create that posture of openness and around the topic of sexuality, then it sort of morphs into it just becomes a part of life that you talk about when it comes up, and
Yeah.
you sort of show that openness to your kids that, hey, this is, there's no embarrassment to talk about this. It's important to approach me if you have questions. It's not something that we're going to, contain to one particular talk at some point in the future when you just are getting ready to go through puberty.
Absolutely. I
So,
think too is helpful if when you're having those talks with your children, that you practice some self-restraint as far as, again, not freaking out if your
yeah.
children ask you something or tell you something about themselves that sounds really scary. I would
Mm,
like to reassure parents that kids, when they're curious and they're growing, are going to tell you, I think this about myself, or I think that about myself.
mm,
And that is just oftentimes a phase that they're going through. And if you want to make them more determined to pursue something you don't want them to pursue, then you can get really upset at them about it,
mm,
and they're going to go, okay, well, I guess I'm on the right track
right.
now. So if you are just calm and willing to have those kinds of conversations with your kids, and this is hard because as
Yeah.
Christians, we want to share our values and we want them to embrace our faith.
Right.
And so we have to figure out how we're going to keep the tension tight between keeping those principles strong, but also being willing to be open and have conversations that are hard with them, and
Right.
not being taken this judgmental stance where
Yeah.
they don't feel they can come to us when they
Right.
are struggling with
And that's a hard thing for a lot of parents to do, I think. I mean, because like you get it when you hear that our kids are entertaining perhaps ideas that or actions that are we would look at as wrong. There's that tendency to jump out right away and sort of nip it in the bud, and we're going to put a stop to it. But we want to walk that line between laying out what are healthy biblical boundaries, but also doing it in a way that doesn't immediately crush them or shut them down. And that's, it strikes me that's often very difficult to do as a parent.
it is. It's very difficult. And that's where wisdom comes in,
Yeah.
right? We need to
Right.
always be praying for wisdom. And it isn't
Right.
easy. And there's no one way to do it. I think it's just an attitude of love toward your child and accepting them, even if you're not accepting certain behaviors that
Right.
they may be engaging in or talking
Right.
about, but letting them know that you do love and accept
Right. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about how sort of the Christian subculture has understood and misunderstood sexuality. Maybe let's shift for a few minutes and talk about how do you think the world understands and makes sense of the meaning and purpose of sex and sexuality. And because it strikes me that the world looks at Christian sexuality, even if it's a mischaracterization, and says, Christians have got it all wrong. They're just, maybe they're prudish, maybe they're too worried about rules and they're too constrained. So the world has this whole other approach to sexuality, and yet it strikes me at the same time that there's a lot of brokenness in our world around the topic of sexuality. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could help us peel back some of the layers and say, what are some of the underlying assumptions about sexuality that our world adopts that are also broken?
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, first of all, I think that it is important to note, and I said some negative things about Christianity and an understanding of sexuality, but actually studies have shown that people who have strong religious values and people who are in marriages have healthier and happier sexual
Mm-hmm.
lives than those who are not. And so I think that's very telling that Christians
Important
do
point.
have a better understanding of the purpose of sex. We may not explicitly be able to articulate it,
Right.
but I think that there still is a more stable place for sexuality within the
Yeah.
Christian community. And I think that we have a gift in that. As far as the world's view of sex, yes, it is very broken, but I think that there's an overlap between what people who aren't within a church context and who aren't religious, what they're desiring out of
Mm.
sex and what we desire out of sex. I think that they're looking for connection just as much as anybody
Mm.
else. And so that's what they really want, but they may be using sex to fulfill a lot of non-sexual needs. And
Mm.
so there's a lot of brokenness, obviously, in this world. And there's a lot of rebellion, too, where people are saying, well, I'm just going to do it my way.
Right.
And, the Frank Sinatra song, I don't know if you're too young to know that
Oh
song,
no,
but
I
I
know
did it
that
my way.
song.
Okay. So that attitude is ingrained in all of us, and that's why we need Jesus. So we need to humble
Yeah.
ourselves and realize that we do have a propensity to try to solve our problems our way. But in the world, there's so many people that are attempting to find connection through
Yeah.
sex, but doing it in ways that they're not getting what they want. And that's very saddening to me to see. Um, there's in psychology, there's an understanding that from early on, people develop certain types of attachment styles. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you've heard of attachment styles before, but when children are very small and they're very dependent on somebody to take care of them, if they aren't receiving care from their caregivers that is reliable, that is warm, that is loving, then they're going to have attachment styles that they develop that are the way they connect with people throughout their lives that are not very healthy. Now, that can
Mm.
change, thankfully. And as a therapist, I have a lot of hope in that, and I
Mhm.
have seen that happen. But it can also cause a lot of problems for people in their relationships. So, say there's a small child who's in an abusive home or a neglectful home where they don't get if they're crying and upset and their needs for affection aren't regularly met, then they may develop either an avoidant attachment style where they just have this attitude of nobody's going to care about me, so I will just take care of myself,
Mm.
and they aren't able to make a close connection with other human beings very well. Or they're going to have an anxious attachment style where they are acting out, so to speak, in order to get attention for
Mm.
themselves. And they're always feeling like nobody can love them, that the other
Mm.
people deserve to be loved, but I don't. And so they're always trying to find ways to make connections in unhealthy ways and be very overly attached to people in a way that isn't healthy. So neither one of those is very good, but that unfortunately is very common for people to adopt one of those two attachment styles if they haven't experienced a secure, loving connection from childhood. And so what we're aiming for is the secure attachment style. But again, in the world, we have people who just don't have what we ultimately understand as a loving relationship with God, who is
Mm.
really the only totally dependent caregiver we will ever
Mm.
experience.
Mm.
And so a lot of people are going to go one of those two ways. And again, it's kind of like that pendulum swing where people will either veer more toward being anxious in their attachment styles and become so needy of other people's affection that they're willing to give up too much of themselves, or they become avoidant and afraid to get close to anyone.
Mm.
And there are a lot of people in marriages where one of those two types of relating to other people predominate.
Right. So I want to touch on a couple things because I think that is so important. What you just described there. A couple things. The first is that you said that people are looking for, whether you're Christian or non-Christian, we're looking for many of the same things. We're looking for that deep connection. What you talked about earlier, right? To know and be known at the deepest level of our being. But when we realize that our own brokenness and the sins of others and our own weaknesses and so on have affected us such that that connection becomes very scary for a lot of people, right? And so we start to
Right.
avoid it, and yet what we see is in some ways a very oversexed culture, right? People, in other words, people are very, very sexually active, and yet what seems to be missing is that willingness to actually be vulnerable in, emotionally, mentally, with another person. It in other words, we try to create sex without the relationship in many cases, right? And I'm thinking
Yeah.
maybe more in like hookup culture, college campuses, and so on. It's the idea that, look, it's just, sex is just physical. It's just what you do with your body. It doesn't, you don't need to get all involved and attached with other people. And yet, as hard as we try to make that work, it just doesn't work. We end up longing for something more. I would suspect that there, and maybe you could comment on this. I would suspect that there's a difference there in male and female, like even in a hookup culture where, you've got people that are, having sex casually. I would suspect that male and female go into it kind of with a different mindset, but both of them are looking in some way for that attachment at that connection, and they're maybe using sex to try to get that in some way, even if they're not fully aware of it. I
Sure.
don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. There, so we talked about how God created us body, mind, and spirit. So, we're not Gnostics. So our
Mm-hmm.
bodies are definitely very involved in sex, and so are our spirits longing for that connection. And I hesitate sometimes. So again, I like to keep the tension tight between these two ideas. Yes, there are a lot of differences between men and women, the way that they respond sexually, but it also exists on a spectrum. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes we think of guys as being the ones that, for them, is take it or leave it as far as the relationship goes. And all they care about is having sex and fulfilling those urges, whereas girls are more longing for the relationship aspect of it. And I would say that generally that can be true, but I think it's changing in our culture. I think that as we see more and more girls engaging in the hookup culture as
Mm-hmm.
well, I think that they are kind of pushing aside that relational need just for the physical
Mm-hmm.
fulfillment as well. And also, I wanted to say in my marriage counseling, I would say that it's about 50-50 as far
Mm.
as who has the higher libido. So we
Mm.
can talk about that more. But as far as the physical need aspect of it, I would say that sometimes I see the men wanting the emotional connection
Mm-hmm.
more and the wives being just happy to have the physical connection.
Right. Interesting.
So, yeah, so I think that it isn't always as cut and dried as we would like it to be.
Interesting. Yeah.
But as far as the hookup culture goes, um, so going back to the physical aspects of sexuality, hormones play such a huge part in
Mm-hmm.
who we are as sexual beings. And again, it's important to always remember that God created us with those hormones, with estrogen and testosterone. And for men, there's another hormone that's very, very important in sexual connection, and it's vasopressin. Have you ever heard
Mm.
of that one?
I've not. No.
So this actually was discovered not that long ago, and it was discovered because some scientists were studying prairie voles, these little rodents, and they wondered, why do these little guys mate for life? And it turns out that when they mate, they produce this hormone called vasopressin, and they realized that that human males also produce this hormone, and it's another type of bonding hormone that creates this sense of you are my person that I am here to protect and have this connection with. So it's like an extra bonding hormone that helps
Wow.
men to be very attached to their mates. And it's released through orgasm, just like oxytocin is, which has also oxytocin. Men and women both release that when they orgasm. And women also have a huge rush of it after childbirth and when
Mm.
they're nursing their babies. And it creates this emotional bond
Mm.
with the other person when you have sex with them. So, unfortunately, what happens when you have sex with multiple partners is the effect of these hormones begins to diminish. And so, your first sexual experience with someone, that will be the strongest release of oxytocin you will ever
Mm.
experience. And that doesn't mean that you cannot bond with other people if you have
Right.
a past. It doesn't mean that, but it just means that we should kind of understand and take seriously the effect that this has on our body.
Right.
And so, as people have these relationships with several, multiple partners over and over again, then the effect on their brain and body that this hormone has, it starts to diminish. And if people are going through like these serial monogamy relationships where they will have this really strong initial attraction, because also you're having other hormones like norepinephrine and serotonin being released in the initial stages of love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you make this connection with someone and you have this glow and these
Mm-hmm.
rose-colored
Mm-hmm.
glasses about this other person. As time goes on, those hormonal responses, they tend to level out, and you
Mm.
tend to have the oxytocin is the one that kind of glues you together, but the ones that make you have this big dopamine rush of um,
Right.
euphoria in your brain, those just calm down. And a
Okay.
lot of people have this idea that something's wrong because I'm not feeling that. I must not be in love with this person anymore. I must not be
Interesting.
attracted to them anymore. But really what's happening is just this normal kind of maturing in your whole body makeup, in
Hmm.
your relationship of bonding with another person. And you're moving to a deeper phase of that. But if you're not having those feelings of euphoria that create that erotic desire
Right.
that people think is supposed to always be there, or there's a problem, then people start to look elsewhere and want to
Right.
have that feeling again.
Right.
And
Right.
so if
Right.
you've had multiple partners and you keep re-experiencing that, it's just like the way a drug affects your brain and body.
Right.
And you start to develop this need for the drug, and you have withdrawals when you don't get it. And so you
Right.
look for another hit.
So it
And that's,
becomes an adrenaline rush in a sense, like the new relationship,
yeah,
the thrill, and but you're what
yes,
you're saying is over time those brain chemicals diminish, but what lasts is the oxytocin and the bonding to another person. That sort of
yes,
kind of remains stable. And so I mean, in that sense, we are built, again, we are chemically, if we can say it like that, we are actually built for this bonding and for this connection.
we are.
Our culture says go off and find the rush and find the sexual thrill and the sexual experience, but deep down what we are longing for is that deeper connection, and we're using sex to get the connection, which works and it doesn't. I mean, it works if you know, especially in a bonded relationship, in a committed relationship, but if you just keep going from person to person, you may be telling yourself that the thrill is what you're after, but deep down what you're really looking for is a profound connection with another person.
Well, sometimes that's what people are looking for, and sometimes they're just looking for getting that, that drug
Hmm.
rush again that they feel because it feels really good. And so
Right.
it's an immature kind of love response where
Yeah.
you're thinking, well, that's what real love is. And so I think just
Right.
educating people that that feeling, it's normal for it to diminish. And that doesn't mean you can't
Yeah.
have erotic love and passion throughout your marriage to
Right.
one person. You
Okay.
can, but it ebbs and flows depending on life circumstances, depending on what's going on in your body at the moment.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff that can affect that, and it takes work to maintain that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people don't want to put that work in, or they're just ignorant and think, well, something's wrong because I'm not feeling this right now. And so they start to go into this new phase of their relationship where they start to see that other person more realistically, and that other
Mm.
person sees them more realistically too.
Hmm.
And then you start to have problems, and you don't have that glow anymore to kind of gloss it over and to blur the
Right.
edges of it. And so that's when people start to get into trouble because
Right.
they have attachment issues that they may have brought into their relationship that make them have an insecurity that makes it difficult for them to maintain connection. They may just have this cultural message that romantic love looks a certain way, and they think that something must be wrong because they don't understand other
Yeah.
deeper types of love. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of education that needs to take place, but there may also be some people need help sometimes to navigate those stressors that come in and start to undermine their relationship and make
Right.
it difficult to repair.
So maybe that's a good segue to the last topic that I want to just discuss with you a little bit is, so you've had experience counseling couples, you've had some experience talking with them about some of the challenges of marriage, in particular in the area of sexuality, and you've touched on some of what some of those challenges are, I think, but I'm wondering if maybe you might just say a little more about what are some of the most common difficulties that couples will express when they come to you, when they come to that point where they're looking to get some help. What are some of the more common challenges that they might be dealing with, and what kinds of what advice can you give to help Christian couples have fulfilling and satisfying sex lives?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah. Well, I would say some of the common difficulties when people come in and want to talk about sexual issues, one of the biggies is guilt from the past.
Mm,
And um, I would say I do an interview with every one of my couples. I'll meet with them when they first come in and find out generally what their issue is that they're presenting with that they say is causing them trouble. And then I meet with them each individually and I
mm,
do a sexual history interview, which I got from a sex therapist who's not a Christian. His name's Barry McCarthy. And I ask them some very personal questions, and they almost always are very upfront and open with me because they
mm,
come for help and they want to be helped. And so I have discovered that no matter what their background, whether they were raised in a Christian home or not, I would say everybody has some sexual baggage that they're bringing into the relationship. And so there oftentimes will be guilt
mm,
from the past that interferes with the present. Sometimes there's trauma from the past as well, where people have experienced abuse or just some kind of relationship issue that has left deep scars and
mm,
wounds that have not ever healed. And so that would probably be one of the biggest issues that
mm.
I deal with couples.
Yeah, because that, I mean, from what you're describing, I think that that could be either, it could be either guilt about something that they've done, whether it's, you know, having sex with more people than they wish they would have, or whether it be
Mhm.
maybe pornography or other related topics.
Yeah.
But it could also be just the way that we are all shaped by our upbringing. And because you talked about earlier, you know, the idea
Yeah.
of attachment. And if we are in a home where we didn't always get the affection and the care that we felt we needed, that comes into the, not only the marriage, I would think, but also into our sex lives as well. The way that we
Absolutely.
approach and understand sex, the way what we expect to get out of it, all of that, right? Because you're talking about the either the avoidant or the anxious presence. I mean, I could
Mhm.
imagine a
Mhm.
person who's avoidant. Um, sure, they'll have sex maybe, but they might be very guarded in a lot of other ways, or they might be just very hesitant to be sexually vulnerable. An anxious person might be overly needy and clingy in a lot of the other areas of the relationship, including in sexuality. And so
Yeah.
all of that can create a lot of friction, I would imagine, if a couple is not aware of those dynamics.
Yes. And so what I usually do with them, well, first of all, is as I'm doing this interview with them, I explore what it was like in their family of origin, and I ask them a question, which is always very interesting to get the answers from, about what 3 words would they use to describe their father, and what
Mm,
3 words would they use to describe their mother. And they'll give me some general things that they would use to describe them, and then I ask them to elaborate on it. So for example, if somebody says about their mother, well, she was loving, I'll say,
mm,
okay, well, tell me ways in which your mother was loving. Well, if they tell me that their mother was loving because she did the laundry and she
mm,
fixed their
mm,
lunch every day for school and she kept a clean house, well, that gives me a
mm,
little bit of information about how maybe they did not experience a lot of warmth and affection from their
mm,
mom physically. And that has a big impact on a person all through life. So if their idea of loving is, doing these acts of service, which
mm,
can be a
mm,
loving thing, but that they never experienced any kind of physical affection from mom or dad, any kind of warmth, any kind of praise. If it was more just going through the motions of doing the job of providing for
mhm,
the family, but not doing what they needed to as far as physical affection goes, that tells me something about how that person has internalized what affection looks like in the
right.
relationship. And so I try when I bring my couples back together then to help each of them to not only understand for themselves how that might have had an effect on them, but for their partner also to kind of see and to bring that out into the room so that they can start to understand not just the content of whatever their conflict is about, but to understand the patterns that they've developed around it, how they are emotionally engaging with one another.
Mm.
And that is usually very eye-opening for everyone, because as they start to see the origin of their partner's inability to connect a certain way, or if they, for example, sometimes I'll have a couple where this is kind of being stereotypical, but say the husband really has a strong sexual desire and he's wanting to have a lot more sex with his wife, and she's feeling very uncomfortable with that and feels like that's all he cares about is
Mm-hmm.
sex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so he's got this pursuer kind of role that he plays in the relationship, and she's withdrawing from that. And that's a pattern that's common in all relationships. Somebody's usually the pursuer in certain
Mm-hmm.
areas, whether it's emotionally, spiritually, physically, and somebody's the withdrawer. And it can change depending on what the topic is. But if he's the pursuer sexually, she's the withdrawer, I try to help them understand, so where did that need come from? What need are you trying to fulfill, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
him, it may be that he feels love and he feels acceptance when he's having sex with his wife, because
Right.
that is where he's being vulnerable and able to show
Right.
up and be who he really is.
Right.
And for her, she may be feeling used and like she has to perform in order to be accepted because he's wanting sex all the time. And she
Right.
may have come from a family where you had to be perfect or you weren't accepted. And maybe he came from a family where there was very little affection and he feels abandoned if she's not connecting
Right.
sexually with
Right.
him.
Right.
So if they can kind of see that about each other, that helps them to have more empathy toward one another and to
Right.
start to work toward fulfilling what the real need is, so that they can have that connection in a healthier way and be
Right.
kinder to each other while they're doing it.
That.
There's a concept, I just want to share this one thing as we're talking about the type of person who has the avoidant attachment and the type of
Mm-hmm.
person that has the anxious attachment. There's a concept I teach my couples that is, I think this is a very biblical idea, and I think that it's very important for all healthy relationships. And it's called differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard that term, Rob?
I have, yeah. When I was in seminary, we covered that at a basic level, but we did spend some time walking through what that's like. But tell my
Yeah.
our listeners and our audience what that means.
Well, in the area of psychology, what this term means is that in order to have the best and most healthy relationship, you need two solid selves in close connection with one another. And it sounds almost paradoxical, which I love because I think there's so many paradoxes in the Bible that are
Mm.
resolved in Christ, and
Mm-hmm.
this is
Mm-hmm.
one that I can see. So the fact that you're maintaining your individuality, you're not giving up who you are. In fact, you're
Right.
being very strongly who you are, but also able to maintain this very intimate and close connection with another person, to me is the epitome of healthy marriage and healthy sexuality.
Right.
Because if one person is giving up who they are in order to please the other person, then one person isn't necessary anymore. I mean, it's like
Right.
you don't even have a relationship then. And so as you're talking about how the Trinity, which, we don't want to go too far with this analogy,
Right.
but how the Trinity models that for us, really.
Right.
There are these three persons, but one God in the
Right.
Trinity,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that paradox I see as how marriage is supposed to be, just
Right.
like you pointed out before, where there's this mysterious way that we can still hang on to who we are, and we must hang on to who we are and strengthen that individual person, but also be able to connect closely with the other. And that's what one flesh means. It doesn't mean a
Yeah.
blob,
Right.
right? It doesn't mean
Right.
you're two people giving up themselves and not being who you are anymore in order to maintain this one flesh. It means you're two separate people, but you're in close connection.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that is a really good place to end, because that captures so much of what I think biblical sexuality is pointing us to. It's that idea of being as completely vulnerable as we know how and as we're able, and but also knowing someone else, and doing that in the context of enormous physical pleasure, but it becomes something that's meant to be so much bigger than that. And yeah, that's you described that very, very well. So I thank you for that. And
Yeah. I was wondering, Rob, before we ended, if I could
mhm.
just share with your listeners some resources that I think are helpful for Christians as
Yeah,
far as
please do.
sexuality goes.
And if maybe what we'll do is, if you share those and then send me a link, and I'll put them in the notes to
I
the
will
show as
do
well. That would be
that.
great. So
Yeah. I think it's important for people to have these resources, because one thing I've discovered is that because we don't talk about sex enough in the church, that it's
mhm,
an uncomfortable topic. But if we can normalize it more, and if people just start reading books that are very well done books with a
mhm,
solid biblical foundation to them, but are also very direct about this topic, that it makes it a more comfortable thing for them as they do that, as they're
yeah,
able
excellent.
to learn more. So one book that I have found very helpful, it's a little outdated, but I still think it has a lot of super good information, is called Celebration of Sex by Dr. Douglas Rosenau. And there's a guidebook, which is like a workbook that goes with it. So if a couple is having trouble in this area, it's a really good way for them to have exercises that they can do with one another. It covers every aspect of sexuality within marriage. So I think
Okay.
that one is very helpful. There's another one that is called The Gift of Sex by
hmm
Cliff and Joyce Penner. And I think he's a therapist and she's a nurse, and they have worked together. They're in Southern California and they're elderly now, and I think they're still talking about sex, which is awesome. But that one covers what I talked about from, the moment a baby is born all the way through the lifespan, what your sexuality looks like, so that it
hmm
makes people have just a big picture view of that, and normalizes again, even, the way that God has created us from the start to be sexual beings, and to have those hormones influence us in so many ways. And then another one that is more about relationship issues, and it talks a lot about the concept of differentiation, which I
hmm
just discussed, is Authentic Human Sexuality by Jack and Judith Balswick. And I think they do a really good job of addressing some of the views that are in the culture
mm
regarding masculinity and femininity, and how that's a really important discussion to have. But we
Right.
don't want to go too far swinging that pendulum the other way, and saying that we have a biblical ethic of what's masculine, what's feminine, that boxes people into something that is not really universally true,
Right.
and that the
Right.
Bible doesn't
Right.
say
Exactly.
is what we need to embrace. And so they do a good job of addressing. And finally, there's a website that I think is very helpful. It's more written for women, but I think men sometimes have read it and benefited from it too. And it's called To Love, Honor, and Vacuum. And it's
hmm
Sheila Ray Gregoire. She's from Canada.
Yep.
And she is not a therapist, but she's a speaker who is very good on the topic of sexuality. And she has a lot of practical advice.
Yeah.
And she is
Excellent.
a Christian.
Excellent. I'm familiar with that last website that you just mentioned, and as well as a couple of the books. So when you send me the links, we will put those in the notes to the show. And those are excellent. I'm so glad that you suggested that, because there will be some, I think, that would want to pursue this a little further and do a little more reading. So,
Sure.
well,
Yeah.
Carmon, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've really appreciated all of your insights and your thoughts on this. So thank you for opening up and kind of sharing your world with us. I do very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate getting a chance to talk about it with you.
All right, so we're going to sign off now. We've got some more videos upcoming in the coming weeks, and so keep watching on this channel. Make sure to subscribe and make sure to get the notifications when new videos are posted so you can stay tuned with all that's going on. All right, again, thank you, Carmon. Great to be with you today.
Thanks, Rob.